Hello once again, and welcome to the live American Krishna sessions where we go deep into the famous Bhagavad-Gita, the famous text spoken allegedly by Lord Krishna himself to Arjuna. We usually read, in our personal life, let's put it this way. My favorite edition of the Bhagavad Gita is the one by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, the founder of the Hare Krishna movement. His Bhagavad Gita as it is wonderful. But here we are going through the Bhagavad Gita study guide written by His Holiness H.D Goswami. I took this photograph, by the way, in Paris a few years ago. He wrote a really wonderfully developed thematic breakdown of the Bhagavad Gita, and as we usually do, we go through the actual text, and then when there's references to verses, we go to the actual chapter and verse and read the actual translation. For those of you who are live here, two of you, welcome. So we're continuing on this topic of the three modes of nature, the influence of these three gunas, as they're called in Sanskrit, the three influences that influence everyone and everything in this world, but not outside this world. Beyond this world is transcendence. Beyond this world is pure sattva, as we can say, where there's Brahman all around, or pure spirit, and at the source of that is the personality, Lord Krishna, of which we are emanations of, and with whom we are, according to the Bhagavad Gita, in a direct relationship of love. So let's go on with the reading in the paragraph to the right here. H.D Goswami, Dr. Resnick, says, our mode choices also shape our perception of reality. So here we're dealing with worldviews influenced by the three modes. Thus, consciousness in goodness perceives a deep spiritual unity within all differences of race, gender, species. This is where at least the non-dualists have it right. When I say non-dualists, I talk about ancient and contemporary philosophers who really love this idea that ultimately there's no difference at all between God and the soul. The soul is God, God is the soul, we are all one, and God has no individual personality. The idea of individuality and relationships ultimately is an illusion. I think that philosophy sucks, but it doesn't suck in the sense of it being wrong, but it's definitely imperfect and incomplete. So, but at least we can say when you have a non-dualist worldview, at least you see the unity in all beings. At least you see that, hey, everyone is ultimately spiritual, and therefore shares of the same spiritual nature. And that's huge already. That's huge. So let's look at verse 1331. In 1331, Lord Krishna says, when one perceives that all beings' distinct states stand in one and expand from that alone, one then advances to Brahman. So this is a verse, of course, that non-dualists would love. See, even Krishna says that when you perceive that all beings' distinct states stand in one, in other words, we're all one, spiritually speaking, and that we are all emanating from that one, then one advances to Brahman. But if we just stop there and forget, for example, that Krishna himself says in another part of the Bhagavad Gita, Brahmano hi pratishtaham, I am the source of Brahman. I, the Supreme Person, am the source of Brahman, then we're missing out on the conclusion or the subtleties of the Bhagavad Gita. So that's that first verse. Now let's go back and look at the other verse that Dr. Resnick refers to. Oh, good. The hyperlinks work. 1820. So in 1820, Krishna says, learn that knowledge and passion is that by which one sees separately in all beings. I'm sorry, that's when you have your worldview influenced by passion. But before that, here's the verse. Learn that knowledge in goodness is that by which one sees a single unchanging reality in all beings, undivided in the divided. So once again, the idea that, hey, look, we're made of the same spiritual stuff. So we shouldn't objectify others and kill them unnecessarily. And that, of course, applies to speciesism as much as racism, as much as discrimination against any group based on externals. These are really important points. So let's go back to what Dr. Resnick or Hridayan Marj is saying here. Whereas passionate perceptions sees such differences as fundamental and final. We just read that one. Mode of passion, where you literally see the other as being radically different, and therefore you can objectify the other and therefore do whatever you want with him or her. So exploitation of others stems from a worldview in the mode of passion, because if you really see others as spiritual in essence, how can you harm anyone? Because in a way that means you're harming yourself. Finally, cognition in darkness sees no truth at all in the world and lacks any power of abstract thought. So this is like your worldview, not influenced by goodness, not even influenced by passion, but influenced by ignorance or darkness. And here's the verse 22. Knowledge that clings irrationally to one task as all that is meager and lacks a sense of truth is declared to be in darkness. So we don't want that type of worldview. We want a worldview, at least in the mode of goodness, where we see the essence of every being. We see everybody as spiritual beings. Let's go back. Thus, the modes are both moral and epistemic. For those of you who don't know what the word epistemic means, epistemology means the branch of philosophy that examines the nature, origin, and limits of knowledge. So in other words, epistemic would mean they define reality. That is, they reflect and condition the moral quality of our acts and also govern how and to what extent we understand the world and ourselves. In other words, they, as he said it so brilliantly, they govern to what extent and how we understand the world and ourselves. Epistemology is all about understanding, like knowing how we know, or how do we know something. Well, here is a tool by which we make sense of the world. So seeing the three modes seeing the world and ourselves through this lens of the three modes is actually very helpful for us. Very helpful for us. So let's continue with the reading. A passionate person may read piles of books, perform many experiments, and contribute vastly to our material knowledge. But only the virtuous soul rises to the clear consciousness by which is seen the ultimate purpose and meaning of life. In other words, don't be fooled by appearances. Someone may be, very well behaved or very well dressed or very learned and so on, but if he or she has a worldview that's very much influenced by passion, what to speak of ignorance, then that fine dressing and erudition or whatever doesn't account to much. On the other hand, you may have someone who's even illiterate, but who may actually be anchored in a worldview that's influenced by goodness or transcendence. That person is worth 1,000,000 times more than the actually ignorant person who may apparently seem to be learned or educated. Paragraph to the right. Rising or falling in the universe, or staying where we are, depends on the mode we cultivate in life, the quality that motivates us and shapes our perception. And when the author here is talking about rising or falling in the universe, or staying where we are, we're talking about reincarnating. Like whether you reincarnate on planet Earth, let's say as a human being, or whether you reincarnate as an animal or in some other form of life on some other planet lower in the universe, or whether you get promoted to some, what's called in Sanskrit, Svarga, Loka, a heavenly planet, still within the material world, where birth, death, disease, and old age is a concomitant factor, depends on the choices you make in this life and how much of those choices are influenced by the modes. So let's go to 14.8 here. 14.8, Krishna says in 14.8, know that darkness born of ignorance bewilders all embodied beings. It binds by madness, sloth, and sleep. Maybe that's not a good reference, actually. Why would that be there? This is just a verse that talks about ignorance. Okay, let's continue. Nature's modes are not mere passive qualities, but rather active powers that force us to act. Let's see if this reference works. 3.5. At 3.5, Krishna says, and remember, these are important verses to hear. Just by hearing these verses, you're supposedly, according to the text, you're hearing God speak. It's like Christians to say, just hear the word, the Bible. The Bible is very powerful. So similarly, the words of Krishna are very powerful. And that's why we love to actually quote the actual verses. Here's verse 5 of chapter 3. In fact, no one ever remains inactive. Oh, that's my phone. 1 second. Okay. No one ever remains inactive, not even for a moment. Nature's modes force everyone to act. In other words, the idea that you can stay inactive, as some Buddhists believe, for example, or some Advaita Vedantists too, although they're at least meditating on Brahman, is not supported by the Bhagavad-Gita. Here, Krishna clearly says, no one ever remains inactive, not even for a moment. Nature's modes force everyone to act. So the real question is, okay, and that's what happens on the battlefield. Arjuna, Krishna tells him, you're going to have to fight. You have to act. So we can't be inactive in this world. We have to act. The modes are pushing us. So which mode do we want to be pushed by? Well, that depends on our little free will and how much do we choose to live in the mode of goodness. And therefore, it's not just like this blind following of rules. You do this, don't do that. There's a real science behind, for example, why we stress the following of what we call the 4 regulative principles. The avoidance of sex outside of marriage, the avoidance of taking drugs, intoxications, the avoidance of gambling, the avoidance of meat eating. And the idea behind the avoidance of these activities is that these activities, when performed, drag our consciousness down to the lower modes of passion and ignorance. When we avoid these activities, our consciousness is very much already situated in this cherished and desired mode of goodness, from which it's much easier to achieve transcendence. Do you follow? Continuing. Oh, let's go back to the actual text here. Thus, the passion mode gives rise to lust and anger, which compel us, even against our rational will, to act badly or even wickedly. You wanna talk a little bit about lust here? Let's go for it, because I think we all deal with it. So let's see what Krishna says about this at 336. At 336 and 37, Arjuna asks this famous question: what impels a person to commit sin, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? Right? As the Christians say, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So Arjuna is like, what makes us weak? That's the kind of question he's asking. Krishna replies, the Lord said, it is lust, it is rage, springing from the passion mode. This is the great devourer, the great evil. Know it here as the enemy. Wow. Just see how Krishna speaks about lust and anger in such pejorative terms. The great devourer, the great evil, the enemy. So, therefore, if we succumb to lust and if we succumb to anger, according to Krishna, we're succumbing to the great devourer. The devourer of what? The devourer of our own spiritual consciousness. Anger and lust devour our own consciousness. Anger and lust are, therefore, spoken by Krishna himself as the great evil. He says, the great enemy, the great enemy. Powerful, isn't it? When we falsely see ourselves as ephemeral flesh, in other words, when we identify with this body, when we think I'm Indian, I'm American, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm this body, bodily cravings shroud our pure cognition. Just as smoke covers fire, dust covers a mirror, or a womb covers an embryo. Indeed, lust, anger, and greed are gateways to darkness that ruin the soul. These are specific words by Krishna. Let's look at them at 1621. At 1621, Krishna says, threefold is this soul-ruining gateway to hell. Can you imagine? Lust, anger, and greed. Those three things are the soul-ruining gateway to hell. Heavy words. Heavy words. And again, when connecting this point to the three modes of nature, it's not an accident that Krishna is speaking about these things, because when we succumb to lust, when we succumb to anger, when we succumb to greed, those ugly modes of passion and ignorance say surprise and grab our consciousness and drag it down. Let's continue a little bit and we can end for today. As we try to enjoy nature's modes and cling to them, we take birth in good and bad wombs based on the quality of our acts and choices. In other words, the choices we made in one life, influenced by X or Y, Z mode, determine what kind of body we end up in the next body, in the next life. 1322, let's look at that. At 1322, Krishna says, indeed, present in nature, soul experiences nature-born modes. Clinging to modes causes soul's birth in good and bad wombs. What do you think? Is this far-out knowledge or what? By conditioning us to act materially, the modes bind us to this world. Goodness, for example, fosters worldly joy and wisdom. But a good person clings to these and thus cannot transcend temporary goodness to reach eternal life. And we're going to end on this because this is an important point to make. One may think, okay, well, if the mode of goodness is the real important thing, then we should just for example, follow these 4 rules. Just be good persons, just be clean, and abstain from sinful life, and that's good enough. No, that's mundane material goodness. As I often say, it's a platform or a trampoline or a launching pad to transcendence. But transcendence is where we want to be at in terms of consciousness. And transcendence only comes when we as individual souls connect with divinity or with Krishna. So that happens when a soul actively reaches out to Krishna and then Krishna reciprocates. Well, it's understood that Krishna is always already reaching out to us. That's why he speaks the Bhagavad-Gita. That's why he's calling us all the time to turn our face towards him. The Upanishads talk about this example of 2 birds sitting on one tree, and one bird is busy eating the fruit while the other, the friend, is just waiting there. Like, when are you going to turn to me? When are you going to turn to me? So we could say God is always waiting for us to turn our face to him. And when we do, though, and then the relationship is reestablished and exchanges of love start happening, that's when we are actually in pure goodness, in transcendence. And that's where we want to be at. That's where we want to be at. So the idea is to follow these 4 rules, not just blindly as a dogma, but because there's a science behind it, as much as we can, and add to that the main meat or tofu of connecting with divinity, of connecting with Krishna by chanting his name, by reading his teachings, or by listening to this podcast, for example, because we're hearing the words of Krishna. And if we do that, then we can be as happy as we can, physically speaking, and experience theoretically unlimited pleasure on the spiritual metaphysical level. Thanks for being here with me together, the 10 of us. And until next time, Hare Krishna.